Very fortunate to have with us today Dr. Elizabeth Meeker, who will share her expertise with us. She's a clinical psychologist and has been working in the area of trauma for the past 12+ years. She's a consultant in the field with coordinated care services and also has a private practice. I think you're going to get a lot out of today's presentation, and I've really enjoyed working on it. So Elizabeth, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Thank you, Kara. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to spend some time talking about the topic of trauma with you. And when Kara and I were preparing for this presentation, she asked what seemingly was an easy question: how long have you been working in the field of trauma? And it actually gave me a moment to take pause, because I've really been specializing in the area of trauma for the past 10 or 12 years when I first started working as a coordinator for a program called the Consortium for Trauma, Illness, and Grief in Schools. But when I stopped and thought about it, I really realized that I've been working with the trauma survivors since my first job, which was over 20 years ago, working in a residential program with adolescent girls. And I think, like a lot of people in the field, as the field has evolved and changed, there's been a growing awareness that whether we realize it or not, we have been working with trauma survivors for a long time. And so through my work originally with residential and then moving into working in clinics and then certainly now my private practice, it's been a growing interest of mine, and I think a critical area that we need to spend time looking at. So our agenda today is to first take a look at the complexity of trauma, what are we talking about, and then move to looking at the impact on development, and finally, more specifically, assessment. Now, as I go through the presentation, I'm going to keep linking we talk about what is trauma and its impact to what you want to be looking at when you're assessing. So I'm really going to be weaving the theme of assessment throughout the presentation. One slide that you won't see is a slide on the DSM criteria of what's post-traumatic stress disorder. And I just wanted to say up front that this was intentional. This wasn't just an oversight. And the reason being that I did that is because I think all of you are familiar with those criteria. You can look them up. And sometimes that distracts us, that if someone doesn't meet criteria, we might not look at PTSD or trauma and so as an issue. So I really want to focus our attention on whether the diagnosis is PTSD or depression or cognitive disorder, really focusing on what should we be assessing for when it comes to trauma. All right, so you should be seeing a polling question popping up. And so if you take a moment to answer that question, I'm going to be starting to talk about the complexity of trauma. So, the field's really evolved, and we've come to realize that we've kind of underestimated and overlooked at times the role of trauma in the lives of the people we work with. And sometimes we've been more focused on the symptoms, the behaviors that come to our attention, what they're referred for, and we attribute it to mental illness or substance abuse without considering how trauma and abuse might have affected them in their lives. And so I hope that today's training will help you to understand how trauma better and then be able to incorporate this knowledge into your work with children and families. One other thing I just want to acknowledge before we go forward is that national statistics would tell us that 55 to 90% of us on this call have had some type of perhaps traumatic event in our own lives, or at least know someone close to us, a family member or friend. And so as we spend time together and I talk, I'll be sharing some stories. Nothing's meant to be upsetting, but if for some reason hits a nerve for you, please take care of yourself. If you need to step out, get a drink of water, go to the bathroom, please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. So if we look at our poll question here, how many of your clients are specifically referred due to trauma, we see that most everyone falls into either a few of clients or most of my clients are, it's about, let's see, about almost 60% are a few or none, and about 45% there are most or all. So let's keep this in mind as we kind of look at the national statistics and see how this compares, because I think what we'll see is that while they might not be referred for trauma, that many people still do have trauma issues. So just to give us a common definition of what we're looking at when we talk about trauma, I use this 3 E's, and I think this is helpful for us, but I also use it when I'm working with clients and families because I think it helps in their own understanding too. So obviously, first thing, there needs to be some type of event, whether that's an individual event like a car accident or an ongoing event like domestic violence that threatens someone's well-being, or that they witness someone whose well-being is threatened. And the other thing is that it's important that they don't necessarily need to witness it directly. They could hear about it, hear about a loved one or someone they care about being impacted by a traumatic event. In response to that event, the individual feels a deep sense of fear or helplessness, and along with that, it really changes. There's an effect that changes their kind of worldview. The world that once felt like a very safe, predictable place now doesn't seem so safe and predictable, and it impacts their ability to trust themselves and others. So just as an example, I've been working with a family who came to me over a year ago. There was a murder-suicide in their neighborhood, and the family happened to be close friends of theirs. So the wife was killed by the husband, and then he killed himself. The family very proactively came to see me about 2 weeks after the event, and at that time it was really psychological first aid, just about what to expect, normalizing their experience. And then about 6 months later, I got a call, and the youngest daughter in the family was now experiencing nightmares and intrusive thoughts, imagining what she thought happened based on news reports. She was very jumpy. She was scared. She was staying close to home, not going over to friends' houses anymore. So while everyone in that family experienced the same event, and they all experienced a sense, I think, of fear and certainly horror about what had happened, she was the only one who it really affected her worldview and had that effect that led to traumatic stress symptoms, where the other family members were able to kind of rebound from that event in a different way. So when we look at traumatic stress, we're looking at it occurs when our ability to respond to a threat is overwhelmed. So I like to imagine those trees in a hurricane, and you see them bending over to the point where you're just wondering, how are they not breaking? And some of them are able to bounce back from that event while others do snap. And so trauma is not the event of the tree snapping or the broken section of the tree. When we use the word trauma, we're saying that the tree's ability to withstand the stress of the winds was overwhelmed, resulting in an injury. So likewise, for the girl I was talking about, her ability to deal and cope with the news of that suicide and homicide of close family friends, it overwhelmed her ability to cope with that news, and as a result, she was experiencing what we would say psychological injury. So I want to spend a little bit of time on talking about different types of traumatic events, and I'm sure this list is familiar to you and things that you've worked on with families and in your practice. As I talk about these types of events, I want to talk about them in terms of how it might impact the assessment when you're working with a family, when you're kind of doing that initial assessment of what might be going on. And so I'm going to touch on some of these, not everything on this list, but the first one I do want to talk about is physical and sexual abuse. And I think we all know that this can be very difficult for especially a child to talk about. And there's often a lot of pressure within the family to keep secret what's going on. With sexual abuse, oftentimes there could even be direct threats that if you tell that I'll hurt someone else in the family. And so with this atmosphere and kind of pressure not to tell, they oftentimes kind of convince themselves that they're to blame for the abuse, and there's a lot of shame wrapped into that. And I tend to think of this almost like a house of cards. and it's very kind of unsteady. And if one person puts down a card to say, hey, this is what's going on, the whole house is going to come tumbling down, because then other people in the family have to take a look at what they might be doing to contribute to the abuse, or what's happened to their own lives, because we know that abuse can tend to be generational. And so if I admit that it happened to me, I also might have to admit that I did it as well from the parent's perspective. So with this all in mind, again, thinking about that, there's a lot of pressure not to disclose. I think about a young lady that I worked with who came to me, and she was referred because she was cutting herself. And when I did the standard kind of, history gathering, there's no indication of any abuse or going on in the home. And several months later, she did end up disclosing that her father had been physically abusing her. But it wasn't until that trust was established that she felt safe enough to make that disclosure. She continued to struggle throughout her treatment, and it wasn't until several years later that she actually ended up disclosing that she had also been molested as a child by an uncle. So again, this just helps us to realize that we can't just kind of do the one-time assessment and maybe have the full picture. It's an ongoing process. When we take a look at severe neglect and abandonment, oftentimes the first abandonment for the child is the perpetrator. It's oftentimes someone that should be in a caretaking role that they love and trust, and instead that person's abandoned their position as that loving individual and instead is harming them. And so after this initial abandonment, there could be a string of further abandonments. If they tell people, maybe they're not believed. There may be removal from the home. There may be multiple placements. And over time, what the children come to believe is loss is to be expected, and why should I bother to get close or to trust someone else because it risks being vulnerable and getting hurt again. So we can see it's very protective for them to do this. And again, they're coming into an office and they might be asked questions, and until that trust is established, it may be difficult for them to really open up and share with you kind of those deepest hurts that have happened, and they may wonder if you'll even believe them. Witnessing violence, oftentimes that can be kind of minimized. Sometimes parents feel like the child was young, they didn't really know what was happening, they were in a different room, they didn't see anything. But it's been my experience that children are very aware of what's happening, even at a very young age, and that domestic violence in the home does impact them. I recently had a call from a person in the community, a mother who was desperately looking for some help for her son, who at this point was being destructive at home and violent, not going to school, using drugs, and had been in touch with the system and kind of given that conduct disorder label. And as she was talking, she just happened to mention that she was a survivor of domestic violence, and that her son's father had been the perpetrator. And when I asked her, had trauma ever been looked at, had he ever received any trauma treatment, what she said to me is, well, we asked him if he remembered anything, and he said no, so I don't think it's an issue. So, oftentimes family, parents don't want to protect their own selves, they may minimize the impact, and just because a child reports, no, I don't remember, doesn't mean that it hasn't impacted them. Also, similarly, kind of with emotional and psychological abuse, it may not be given kind of that, it may be minimized as well. And often survivors, though, tell me that those abusive messages, you're stupid, you're no good, you're worthless, those are the tapes they can't get rid of in their head. But if you have heard them so often and you come to believe them to be true, you might not see that as something that's traumatic. If someone asks you, oh, has anything traumatic happened to you, you just kind of accept that as the reality. So they might not even see things in that lens, which is why we have to ask and assess and weigh multiple ways to really get a full picture, and not just simply ask the question, has anything traumatic happened to you? And that type of theme comes up with some of these other issues as well, in terms of poverty and rape or illness or disaster. So I'm not going to spend any more time kind of going through these. I think you get the idea of kind of the importance of broadening the way we look at this. So let's see, did the next polling question go up?
Sorry,
Okay, so
typing.
all right, so we have another polling question here about how many of your clients have a known history of trauma. So we'll give you a moment to answer that. And as you're doing that, I'm going to kind of start to talk about what we know about the prevalence of trauma. Through the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Event Study, which I'll talk about a little bit further in a few moments, we know that between 14 to 34% of children have experienced at least one potentially traumatic event. That study really looked at abuse and neglect type issues. So if we broaden it and look at community violence or disasters or accidents, we could see that it may actually be a higher number. What we know about the public mental health system is that at least half to almost all of clients walking through the door have been exposed to trauma, and most of those people have been exposed to multiple traumas. And again, you know, it's been my experience that it's very rare for someone to come and call and say, I'm looking for an appointment because I had this traumatic event happen to me. It's much more often that they're being referred because they're depressed or anxious, or, you know, for kids that they're acting out or can't pay attention in school, and people think they may have ADHD. And so the referral question is usually not directly linked to the trauma, although many people have that trauma history. It's the same thing as we start to look at the different doors that people might enter into the system through substance abuse, about 2/3 of men and women, and looking at juvenile justice, 75 to 93%. And again, many of those youth have had multiple traumatic events, and it's rare if they're screened, let alone get any treatment for those traumas. So I'm looking at the results here, and it looks like it's kind of evenly split through the different categories, that almost like a 12%, and then kind of in thirds here of how many people have known trauma history. So again, it just points to the fact that people may not be aware in terms of the referral or what people are reporting, and the importance of really screening for that based on the numbers that we know to be true in the population. Some of you may be familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. This was a study conducted in the 90s with adults. Over 17,000 adults were sent a survey, and they indicated which kind of, out of 10 traumatic events had they experienced prior to the age of 18. And this was really, I think, eye-opening to everyone in terms of the degree of number of people who have really experienced trauma in their lives and the impact of that trauma. So what they found was more than half of respondents reported at least one, and a quarter reported two or more categories of childhood exposure. And there was a relationship that was seen between the number of categories and health risks. And so, not surprisingly, if they had multiple, 4 or more adverse events, they were more likely to be at risk for alcoholism, drug abuse, depression, suicide attempts. I think all of us, that makes sense. Interestingly, they also found that the greater number of these exposures, they also had greater number of health risks, so more heart disease, cancer, lung disease. And so if we take a look what's going on this triangle, you'll see that once there is some type of adverse childhood experience, it puts people at greater risk for disruptive neurodevelopment. We're going to talk about the brain in a minute, which then impairs their social, emotional, and cognitive functioning. To adapt to those impairments, they might adopt high-risk behaviors, substance abuse, eating disorders, smoking, self-harm, sexual promiscuity, which puts them at greater risk for then disease and disabilities, and then ultimately early death. And so when we take the statistics that we're talking about together with the potential impact on people, we can start to put together a picture of why we need to take universal precautions. We need to be screening anyone who walks through our door, because based on the statistics, there's a high probability that they've had some type of traumatic exposure, and there's really high risk for them in terms of outcome if that trauma is not addressed. So we're going to start to drill a little bit deeper now into the impact of trauma on development. And so I want to start talking about what happens when we experience a terrifying event. We're very fortunate that our body is equipped to respond quickly in order to protect us. And if you think about this from an evolutionary standpoint, it makes a lot of sense because it's helped us survive as a species. So way back when we were hunters and gatherers, and you think about what happens if you encountered a tiger or a wild animal in the jungle, you know, and what would have happened if we stopped and thought and pondered what to do in that situation. We probably wouldn't have made it. So fortunately, we have this system in place where we may have fought back, so grabbed a spear and tried to fight that tiger. Or we might have decided, you know what, the best thing to do is to get out of here and run as fast as we can. Or lastly, we might freeze and just play possum, lay down, hope the tiger sniffs us and moves on. And so this automatic fight, flight, or freeze system still works today. The tigers in our lives just look a little different. So as I said, this response is a normal response to frightening situations, and we really don't have any control over how we respond. This response has to do with the way our brains respond to threat or danger. And when we respond with fight or flight, fight or flight, we use up the energy that accumulates in our body. So there's a huge release, a surge of stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and when we fight or freeze, we're using up that energy. A lot of energy is going to our arms, our legs, to give us strength to be able to run or fight. But when we respond with freeze, that energy accumulates. So those stress hormones, that energy is just accumulating in our body. It's trapped in our system. And this is where a lot of the symptoms stem from, and that may develop as a result of traumatic stress. So understanding this response is really important in terms of your assessment and later intervention. If you've ever been like in a minor fender bender, you know what it feels like, that you kind of feel hyped up for hours afterwards. You're on edge. And this is those elevated stress hormones. Now, interestingly, those stress hormones can stay elevated in your system for up to 6 weeks. So it's not just immediate and then they go away. They can kind of linger in the system. So now let's think about this for a child in an ongoing abuse situation. Their brain is constantly being bathed in these stress hormones. And this is the way they're showing up to school. This is the way they're showing up in your clinic. They're in fight, flight, or freeze mode, and that survival mode is kind of their constant state of functioning, and their mode of functioning. It's like the system is stuck and they haven't been able to turn off that response. So I want to move into talking a little bit more about what's going on in the brain. And the first part of the brain I want to talk about is our reptilian brain, or instinctual part of our brain. And this is the part that regulates all our basic functioning. So breathing, heart rate, everything, our state of arousal gets controlled from the brain stem here. And this, again, comes into play when we need that rapid mobilization of energy in times of danger. So that is that fight, flight, or freeze response. And it allows us to act before we even know why. And this is really important because it's going to come into play later, and something you're probably going to hear in your assessment. Those kids who, when you ask them, why did you do something, that invariable answer is, I don't know. When something's coming from this part of our brain, we really don't know. We do it before we even know why we're doing it. The next part of our brain I want to talk about is the limbic system, or our emotional part of our brain. It's also been called the mammalian part of our brain, and this is crucial for the development of relationships and attachment. And oftentimes when I'm talking to people and even families kind of about what's happening in their brain, I'll compare the reptilian part of our brain to if you ever had a pet lizard. You know, they don't really need a lot of attention. They're not interactive. They're not playing with you. You know, they just are focused on survival, and that's what that part of our brain is about. The limbic system is like your pet dog or your cat. It needs that attachment, that attention to survive. And so this is that attachment part of our brain that's kind of developed, and it's hardwired to connect. And the amygdala is also in this part of our brain. This is where that fear response gets triggered. Also, our hippocampus is there, and that's where our memories is involved with memories and putting the pieces together. So that is important to think about, because when a traumatic event happens and that fight, flight, or freeze gets activated, it impacts the way memories are stored in our brain and encoded in our brain. Oftentimes you'll get people talking about those fragments that aren't sequenced. And there's a reason for that, which we'll get to in just a minute. The frontal cortex, or the thinking part of our brain, this kind of came online as we further developed as human beings here. And this part of our brain allows for decision making and planning and organizing. It allows us to evaluate and analyze, to pause before we act. Insight and empathy, all of these things are happening in this part of our brain. So now when a frightening event happens, it goes very fast from that event to our response. And when we perceive danger, that amygdala, that limbic system, overrides our frontal cortex. So what happens is we bypass the thinking part of our brain. And for survival, this makes a lot of sense. We don't want to pause and analyze and consider our actions. We just want to do something to survive. But there's implications for this, especially for children in chronic abuse situations. If the chronic part of my brain keeps getting numbed out and keeps going offline, it's going to be underdeveloped. So I'm not going to be able to evaluate as well or make sense of what's happening. I'm certainly not learning how to organize and plan and set goals. Also, the language part of our brain, it gets turned off and shut down during a traumatic event. So when they come in and you ask them about it and they are not able to put words to what happened, it's because that part of the brain had been kind of turned off. So as we think about this and the implications about this, you know, and you think about what you get as referrals from parents and caregivers and teachers, oftentimes, you know, they're talking about their frustration by children who have trouble with organization and planning and setting goals and impulsivity. And it gives us something to think about. What is the role of trauma and how that's impact that developing brain and the presentation that you have in front of you. So I want to now talk about kind of what this is going to look like in terms of development in these core areas in terms of interpersonal and intrapersonal cognitive and regulatory development for children. So when we take a look at the regulatory and emotional realm, when a child's been in a chronic trauma situation, they often have deficits in their ability to regulate physiologically and their emotional experience. These are the kids who get flooded with emotion. And they have difficulty understanding what they feel, how to cope with it, how to express it. And they have a very small window of tolerance for affect. So they can fluctuate from being under-aroused to hyper-aroused. So these are the kids that are referred to, and they're described as going from 0 to 100 without any probable cause. It just, you know, 1 minute they're fine, and the next minute they're off the wall. When they're asked what happened, these kids invariably say, I don't know. And, you know, oftentimes these are the kids who are blowing out of classrooms. They're defiant. And so everyone's very focused kind of on these big behaviors that they're seeing. But they have a lot of difficulty just regulating themselves in their system. Intrapersonally, so within themselves, oftentimes you will hear the negative self-concept, that reduced sense of competency, feeling like they lack power and control in their lives. that they see themselves as failures, they blame themselves, and they really have a reduced sense of a future and a future orientation, any hope for the future. Oftentimes, these are the kids who are referred for depression or referred because they're not motivating, they're not working up to their potential. We know they could be doing better than they're doing. They have an I don't care attitude, and then when you talk to them, there's just this lack of hope for a better tomorrow. Interpersonally, in the social realm, oftentimes they have difficulty forming and maintaining relationships. They have difficulty reading social cues. They might be overly rigid with boundaries or very open and too diffuse with their boundaries. They lack trust. This makes me think of a girl that I worked with who came from a home where there was domestic violence, and she had also been molested by her mother's boyfriend. And this young lady saw hostility everywhere in any person she encountered, especially any boys. And her strategy for dealing with this and how she would come dressed is she would be totally in black, wearing spiky type of jewelry, and her message to the world was, don't mess with me, don't bother me. But at the same time, underneath that, she deeply wanted connection with people, but she was so frightened and so scared of taking that risk. So there was a real push-pull. And cognitively, as we've just kind of discussed, trauma can be very toxic to the brain, and so there can be lags in receptive and expressive language, difficulty sustaining attention and concentration. There can be those impairments in the executive functioning, the planning, the problem solving, delaying response, retrieving information, and oftentimes these places kids at higher risk for disciplinary problems in school, dropping out. So, you know, oftentimes I think about the profile of the child who's referred for ADHD, and then, you know, then the diagnosis turns into ODD, and then finally they get the conduct disorder label. But underneath it may be the trauma. So I want to start to think about, well, how does this trauma show up? What might we see? And as we were talking about with that fight, flight, or freeze response, for many trauma survivors, their internal alarm system is easily triggered. So they're detecting smoke where there is no fire. So, you know, I always think about kind of when I may be cooking at home and that fire alarm goes off because maybe I overcooked something. And so I know that there's no danger there. So I go to my fire alarm and I wave my towel in front of it, and as it keeps going off, I take the battery out. Well, for these kids, they can't take that battery out. That alarm system is going off over and over again, and they're detecting smoke all the time. And when they do, you know, if they see something or hear something or even feel something that reminds them of the trauma, even if they're aware of that or not, it's as if they're back there again. So if we talk about kind of that being back, that brain stem, that kind of that automatic response for survival, they're going to act without even knowing why at that point. And they get that same rush of those stress hormones as if they were back there again, even if they're in a safe situation. And so while that fire alarm system is great when there's an actual fire, it's not so helpful when there isn't really a fire happening. So what you might see in young children is a literal reenactment, maybe hiding and crying, strong outbursts or tantrums. And those might be the things that are being reported when you meet with a family. In school-age children, you might hear about the physical symptoms, the stomach aches, the headaches, the frequent flyers to the nurse's office. And they tend to move between, again, that under-aroused, so being withdrawn or quiet, or that hyper-aroused, that aggressive and being very noisy. For teens, you might hear about withdrawing from activities to avoid any reminders, engaging in high-risk behaviors, or reporting that they feel like they're worried that they're going crazy because all this flooding of emotion is just kind of making them feel out of control. I just want to share this list of common post-traumatic types of triggers, and not that I'm going to go through all of these, but just for you to start to think about how many things just in daily life for these kids can be triggering, including you. As you look at that first one there, therapy and therapist, and being asked questions, that can be very triggering for people. So if you think about, maybe a child who's coming from a home where there's domestic violence, there's loud noises, there's authority figures who are doing abusive things, and they're not allowed to speak. And now I'm at school, and there's lockers being banged, and there's kids in the hallway that are noisy and bumping into me. There's teachers and principals who are in charge, and they're telling me to sit down and be quiet and not talk. You can see how someone could be triggered, and it's not that they have awareness of this or insight into this, and certainly the adults might not have that. They might not even know that there is things going on for this child. But the focus is going to be on the behavior, that this child's not paying attention, that they're disrupting the classroom, and we can start to see the kind of how this pattern can come together because they're being triggered post the original event, the original traumatic events that have happened. So over time, the trauma survivor may experience many symptoms which they may or may not kind of talk about. And if these symptoms continue to persist, we might start to see a range of behaviors. And these are the types of behaviors that start to get survivors labeled in some way. So we start hearing about the cutter, or the bad kid, or the problem behavior, or the runner. They get labeled by their symptoms. And the further away we get from the trauma, the less likely we are to be making that connection to the traumatic event. And these are likely to be the referral questions and the referral problems that you see. As a colleague of mine says, that these symptoms, these behaviors, are the trauma talking. And if we can come to understand where the behavior comes from and have this greater understanding, we have the possibility of having more compassion and empathy for the survivor. And so despite the behaviors, and these behaviors can be really hard to deal with, we have greater understanding and greater compassion for the child. So just to kind of touch on some of these and what might be going on, when we look at that persistent despair, that's that interpersonal, intrapersonal domain again, that sense of that life is no good and that it's not going to get better, that you'll kind of hear that when they're talking. I remember talking to a young lady, and it was holiday time, and I was, it was also her birthday, and I was asking her if she was excited about kind of the upcoming event, and she looked at me almost as if I had three heads, and she was like, there's nothing I want to celebrate in my life. My life never been good. I don't think it's going to get better, and why would I want to kind of recognize another year kind of on the planet? So those are some of the things that you might hear. For some youth, and sometimes you might actually have people who are coming out of the hospital post a suicide attempt or serious suicidal ideation, and for these youth, it's kind of a reflection of how much pain and the intensity of the pain that they're dealing with day to day. And oftentimes that suicide, it may sound sort of strange, but can be that safety valve for them, that they know if they have kind of a way out from that pain. Sometimes they talk about that almost as being that sense of relief. But again, sometimes we get caught up in that behavior or self-injurious behavior where we start to focus on that and trying to stop that behavior. But those behaviors are an expression of how much pain that they're experiencing because of the trauma. Eating disorders, sometimes we see these develop, and for some trauma survivors, it's a way of being able to have some type of sense of control. So I didn't have control over what the perpetrator was doing to my body, but now I can control what's going into and out of my body. So while not all people who have eating disorders have a trauma history, it's one of those flags to try to explore further to see what might be going on. We certainly get a lot of children who are referred for outbursts and acts of aggression. And for many of these children, they may have been in a household where they could never express that anger. They had to stuff it down. And so now, again, it's that trigger. When they're being in front of an authority figure, they tend to go off. So you can see this list and kind of get the theme of what we're talking about. So taking a look at what these behaviors are and what might be underneath those behaviors. And, you know, many times we can get caught up, unfortunately, kind of in trying to stop the behavior. But if we're not treating the trauma underneath the behavior, oftentimes what you see is a new symptom pops up or that symptom kind of intensifies. Because if this is how I've survived that situation, I'm not likely to try to be willing to give it up until I know that I'm safe or have other more adaptive ways to deal with those behaviors. So kind of to summarize this section, kind of current problematic behaviors and symptoms may have originated as legitimate and even courageous attempts to cope with or defend against the trauma. And this is something you can also use in your assessment in terms of exploring with a young person and their family how that symptom, how that helps them to survive. And it kind of starts to put it in a new light, but it also starts to explore what was kind of underneath that behavior. So I think we have another, do we have another question coming up? Was there a question on assessing for trauma in your work? Okay. So we have a polling question here about current assessing for trauma. So if you could answer that, and I'm going to just start to talk about this section of trauma assessment. So there we go. So I came across this quote, and I find it to, unfortunately, that it's truer often than not. And in my own work in the county several years ago, I used to be responsible for signing off on eligibility for like waiver services and other in-home supports. And so I would read these packets about the children, and I would see that there was documentation of trauma, that there was physical abuse, sexual abuse, witnessing domestic violence, but there was little connection between those traumatic incidents and the current behaviors. So there was that miss between kind of, you know, what had happened to the child in their life and what we were seeing now. And so it was assessed for, but it wasn't necessarily being addressed or incorporated into the assessment of what was happening for this child. And so for me, the question became, how do we as a system start to increase our understanding of trauma, the impact on individuals, and then provide services in a way that reflect that understanding? So, you know, I think one thing that's really important, and you might have heard this concept, is around trauma-informed services. And while trauma-specific services, being able to provide specific evidence-based practices for trauma are really important, if it's not happening within a trauma-informed system and there's people who understand trauma who are then referring people and trauma is being assessed for, we're going to miss that opportunity. And we have the potential for potentially re-traumatizing people, because if they're coming to us and we're not recognizing it and then we're treating them for something else, we're really minimizing that experience, and we're going to miss the opportunity to treat what the real issue is. So moving into kind of screening, the first thing, oh yes, thank you. So assessing for trauma. So it looks like some of you, about a quarter, are using some kind of standardized assessment. Many of you, which is great, are asking questions about trauma, and about 10% are not formally assessing for it. So this section that we're talking about can add to your toolbox about what you can do, how to ask the questions, but I would also really encourage you and your clinic to think about developing some standardized ways that you are addressing for trauma, because if we look at those statistics, we know many people have that as a history, and it ought to be part of our standardized practice. So for an initial screen, it's asking that question about has some type of traumatic exposure happened? And again, it may or may be known. But for a trauma-informed standpoint, I just want to highlight two pieces first. And that is something I'm sure many of you do, is first just assessing first client stability. So is the risk of them being at, of hurting themselves or others? And if it's a yes for that question, obviously the issue at that point is getting them somewhere safe, and we're not going to kind of continue with and pursue a further trauma assessment at that point, and further risk kind of dysregulation. We also want to know about environmental stability. So if there's a high risk that there's still domestic violence in the home or other abuses happening, they're not in a safe situation, obviously we need to address that first. That's the primary issue. So once you've kind of gotten through that initial screen, and if there has been a trauma exposure, then we want to move forward with a comprehensive assessment process. And the goal of that assessment is to form a unique picture of what's going on for that child and family. So we want that more detailed trauma history. We want to look at what is the current symptom presentation, including those symptoms that may or may not be seen related to the trauma. What's the context of what's going on now in key relationships, and then taking a good look at that developmental history, as we kind of already talked about, to kind of see if some of those things kind of create a clearer picture of what's been happening. I just want to point out that this doesn't only have to happen at that initial intake. I know many of you may get transferred cases, and that might be a time to reassess and reevaluate what's been happening. Also, if you've kind of been working with the family for a long time and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere, there might be something missing. It might be an opportunity to reassess. Or, as I mentioned before, you might get a disclosure, and then you're going to be doing further assessment. So when we look at this comprehensive assessment process, we're going to be looking at both there's some standardized measures, and that's included at the end of this presentation. And these can be really helpful because there may be things that people aren't comfortable reporting out loud, but they would be willing to indicate it on a form. And usually these forms are easy to administer. There's some that get more at symptoms, some get more at trauma history, and they're a good part of an assessment process. But they're not sufficient because we really need that clinical piece too, in terms of listening to the child and caregiver's perspective about the trauma, observing their body language, their affect. What is it that they share? What don't they share? What kind of attributions do they make? Their cultural perspective on what has happened. Looking at the child and family together to get a sense of attachment and roles in the family. And you're not going to get that from a form. So it's important to have both of these together to kind of put together your picture. So I want to talk about, how do you ask those tough questions? Because it's hard, and I think some of us avoid asking it because we don't want to upset a child. We're just getting to know them. And so, here are some ways that I ask some of these questions. And again, I don't just kind of have it as a rote form kind of going down the list, but, as I'm talking to them about different feelings, I'll ask them, to tell me about times when you felt really frightened or scared. And that might set the stage to kind of start to get information about things that have happened to them. Asking just about changes or losses in the family, that's another way to start to get at what may have also been traumatic, and asking about the worst things that have happened in your life. Now, these questions are important to ask because you're setting the stage and sending a message to the child that it's okay to talk about these things here. I can handle it, and this is a safe place to talk about these things. It's also important when you kind of go down this road, and I do this with kids in general, is to set up with them, you know what, if I ask you something and it's something that you don't want to talk about, it's okay to say pass. Why this is important is you don't want to put them in that position of having to, if they're not ready to talk about it, to say, I don't know, or no, or deny it. If you give them that opportunity to say pass, it gives you a flag to say, there might be something further to explore here, and come back to it at a further date as you develop your relationship with the child. So these are some ways to start to broach those conversations. Some tips just on using those screening instruments. It's really important to put them in context, that you don't just hand the forms to the family and ask them to fill it out and it just seems like more paperwork. You really want to tell them why you're using them and how they're going to be used, that you're going to be following up with them about what happened or about the results of those forms. They are also a really good way to explore something further. So if a child maybe didn't indicate something scary or frightening has happened to them, but they circle yes on a form, it opens the door to start to talk about and have that conversation. Obviously, you want to know about any critical items on those instruments and follow up with those immediately if someone indicates yes. And it's so important to provide feedback to the family about the results of those screenings and asking them if it fits with their experience, it kind of makes sense. Some additional approaches, you know, especially for younger children, observing play, looking for that repetitive play is really important that you might see. And for some children, too, bibliotherapy can be really a good entree. There's a book I list there that I use with younger children. Again, it sets the stage. It says it's okay to talk about these things here. It gives an example of someone who is sharing something terrible that happened to them. Pictures can be another great tool because if I don't have the words to explain what happened to me, if I can draw a picture of the scariest thing that happened or the worst thing that happened to me, that might be easier and give a starting point to that conversation. For school-age kids, worksheets are great, using like incomplete sentences or having sheets that say kind of my favorite things about my family, things I don't like about my family, and having them fill that out. They're used to doing those sorts of things in school. A loss history is a tool that I use a lot where you draw a line and at one endpoint is their first memory and then at the other endpoint is how old they are now, and then they divide it up into 4 sections as kind of markers and then fill in different losses that have happened along the way. So, you know, death, divorce, moves, changes in friends, changes in health or illness in the family, incarcerations that may have happened. And it starts to create a picture for you and for them of kind of what's happened in their life. And a lot of times you might see clusters like, wow, between 9 and 11, a lot happened for you. And you start to put that together. And while any one of those events in and of themselves, you might think, well, that might not have been overwhelming. You can start to put it together and you can see kind of where that trauma might be coming from. Trauma history, Greenwald, he offers a nice way to have a conversation and gathering information about the worst things that have ever happened to you. He uses a list format and then has the children then rate how they feel about those things when they think about them now and gets their age. And again, it starts to put together a picture. So I think, you know, kind of that's where we are really trying to hope to get out of this assessment process is that, you know, on paper you might get this sketch of a child of what they look like, what people are seeing as the symptoms, the behaviors. As you start to do your assessment process and you're gathering information, the picture becomes a little bit clearer and you're kind of getting a better sense of what's going on. When you start to have that real clear picture is when you're putting yourself in a situation, you know, and getting ready to then be able to offer appropriate triage and treatment for a family. And I just want to emphasize again that assessment's an ongoing process. It doesn't just occur at the beginning of treatment. If things start to get fuzzy again, it might be time to step back and reassess. I find this to especially be true when you start to see symptom hopping or history of symptom hopping where they had, you know, they were cutting, but then they started using, and then they started, you know, having eating disorder. And that to me is a clue about what's missing. What aren't we getting at with these behaviors? What's underneath them? Why would anyone act this way? This clarity is not only helpful for you, but really important to share with, you know, kind of the client and the family. I have found a tremendous shift happens through this assessment process because along the way you're providing psychoeducation about trauma, its impact on the brain, and there's this huge sense of relief and the spark of hope that happens because, you know, the child starts to realize, and the parent, that, you know, I'm not going crazy, or that I'm not a bad parent, and it provides that sense that healing can happen and a doorway to kind of move forward and starts to put things in a new perspective. So I think we have a few minutes at this point for some questions. Kara?
Hi, yes. Elizabeth, thank you so much. That was really great information. We do have a few minutes for some questions. Diana's going to read some questions that she's been receiving through the text box. And I just want to ask everyone to just stay a little longer to fill out our survey at the very end. We really appreciate your feedback. Okay, Diane, you want to read some questions?
Absolutely. I think one of the questions probably was answered on the last slide, but somebody did ask, is there a particular screening tool that you, Elizabeth, would recommend, and how would they get to it? Is there a website or something?
Yeah. If you look, and let me see, here we go. So the UCLA PTSD Index is one that I recommend for a couple reasons. It looks at both of symptoms. It collects information on symptoms and also on events that have happened, traumatic events. And it's available online and it's free. So it also has a good, it's been tested and evaluated. So it's a good screening tool that I would recommend.
And I just want to chime in really quickly, sorry, that you can actually click on these highlighted measures and it will take you directly to the website where you can find the assessment, okay?
Thanks, Kara.
Another question, if we have time for one more, is what is it that we can do early on so that we don't have to wait 3 years for a child to disclose abuse?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's setting the stage about that these are okay to talk about, normalizing it. So oftentimes, you know, as I'm working with a child and family, I will share, you know, sometimes, and you're going through this assessment process, sometimes scary or frightening events happen for children. You know, some kids tell me that, you know, there's been fighting in their home or someone has hurt them in some ways. Other kids have witnessed accidents or seen someone gone through a serious illness. So I start to normalize that those are things that happen to kids and, you know, try to make it more comfortable for them to share that. But the disclosure can be hard depending on, again, the context and the family situation. That one young lady that I mentioned, when she disclosed about the physical abuse that had happened, her whole side of her father's family cut her off. So she lost contact with her siblings, grandparents, aunts and uncles. So it was a huge risk for her to now make a second disclosure if I lost half my family on the first disclosure. So those are some of the contextual things you have to kind of keep in mind. Any other questions, Diane? Okay.
I think it's time to close up, Elizabeth. Thank you so much once again. I wanted to remind everyone that our slides will be on our website, www.ctechny.com. The slides and the recording will be on by tomorrow. And please answer our survey, and you can ask me any questions that you might have for Elizabeth. My information is on the last slide, the contact information. So you can email me with any further questions, and Elizabeth will be happy to answer them.
Kara, I just wanted to clarify for people, when you said they could click on those links, they can click on the links when they download the slides from the website. You can't do it right now through the webinar.
Oh, correct. Yes. Thanks, Diane.
All
and
right.
I just want to encourage everyone to join us next month where we will be talking about trauma and treatment, and we hope to see you then. You'll be getting information by early next week about that webinar and when it will take place. I hope everyone has a great day, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.